I live in a place where the horizon is nothing but corn and dead grass. It's the kind of silence that has a weight to it, a pressure that pushes against your eardrums until you start hearing things just to fill the void. My house is an old farmhouse, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. I've always liked the isolation, but 3 weeks ago, the isolation started feeling like a trap. It started on a Tuesday, right as the sun was dipping below the stalks, turning the world that bruised purple color of a fading sunset. I was out on the porch, smoking a cigarette, when I saw him. A man was standing about 50 yards out in the field. He wasn't moving, he was just a thin, dark silhouette against the orange sky. He looked too tall, his arms hanging a bit too low past his knees. I waved, thinking it was old Miller from down the road, but there was no response. He just stood there, facing my house. I went inside and locked the door. I told myself it was just a drifter or a hunter, but when I checked the window an hour later, he was closer, 20 yards. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of my gravel driveway. I turned on the porch light, and my heart nearly stopped. He wasn't wearing a coat, despite the biting October wind. He was wearing a tattered, filth-streaked suit that looked decades old. His skin was the color of wet parchment, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for his neck. But it was his face that ruined me. He had no eyes, just smooth, pale skin where the sockets should have been. Yet I knew with every fiber of my being that he was staring at me. I spent the night in the kitchen with a butcher knife in my hand. Every time the house creaked, I jumped. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started. It wasn't at the door, it was coming from under the floorboards, like someone was trying to find a soft spot in the wood. I stood in the center of the room, watching the floor, terrified that a pale, spindly finger would poke through the grain at any second. The next morning, the man was gone. I walked out to the driveway, my hands shaking. There were no footprints in the gravel, no bent stalks of corn, nothing. I tried to convince myself I had a fever dream until I got to my truck. Written in the thick layer of dust on the windshield were 4 words in jagged, shaky handwriting. I like your breath. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I boarded up the windows, but it didn't help. The scratching moved from the floor to the walls. It followed me from room to room. I would sit in the hallway, the only place with no windows, and listen to the sound of something heavy dragging itself around the perimeter of the house. Then came the whispering. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the vents, a dry, papery sound like dead leaves blowing in the wind. It didn't use words at first, just a rhythmic clicking of the tongue. But on the 5th night, the clicking stopped, and a voice, hollow and ancient, sighed my name through the floorboards. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like the house itself was learning how to speak. Yesterday, I found the cellar door open. I know I locked it. I descended the stairs with a flashlight, my breath hitching in my throat. In the far corner of the coal cellar, I saw a pile of old clothes I didn't recognize. I stepped closer and realized they weren't clothes. It was skin. Thin, translucent sheets of it, shed like a snake's, shaped perfectly like a man. I ran back upstairs, but when I reached the kitchen, I realized the house was different. The furniture was shifted an inch to the left, the pictures on the wall were tilted, and there, on the kitchen table, sat a single, fresh tooth. A human molar. I felt my own mouth with my tongue, counting, praying. All mine were there. I'm in the bedroom now. I've pushed the dresser against the door. The scratching has stopped and the silence is back, that heavy, suffocating silence. But it's worse now, because I can hear a wet, rhythmic breathing coming from under my bed. And for the first time, I realized that the man in the field wasn't trying to get in. He was waiting for whatever was already inside to finish its work. The breathing under the bed is getting louder. It's matching my own rhythm. I'm staring at the edge of the mattress, watching a pale, lipless mouth slowly crest over the side, revealing rows of flat, human teeth. It isn't going to scream. It's going to whisper. And I know, deep down, that when it does, I won't be the one who walks out of this house tomorrow. I never pick up hitchhikers. It's a rule I've lived by since I started driving long-haul routes across the Northern Territories. The roads up there are lonely, flanked by pines that grow so thick they swallow the light even at noon. But 3 nights ago, the rain was coming down in sheets, so heavy that my wipers couldn't keep up, and my headlights were failing to pierce the gray wall in front of me. Then, in the middle of a stretch of road 50 miles from the nearest town, my engine just died. The silence that followed was absolute. No hum of the heater, no radio static, just the frantic drumming of rain on the metal roof of my old sedan. I tried the ignition. Nothing. I sat there for 20 minutes, debating whether to stay put or start walking. That's when I saw him in the rearview mirror. He was sitting in my back seat. I didn't hear a door open. I didn't feel the car shift under his weight. He was just there, a dark mass in the shadows. My heart didn't just beat, it slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I just stared at his reflection. He was wearing a yellow raincoat, the kind fishermen wear, but it was dripping with something thicker and darker than rainwater. His hood was up, casting a deep shadow over his face, but I could see his hands resting on his knees. They were gray, the skin wrinkled and translucent like they'd been submerged in water for weeks. "Keep driving," he whispered. His voice didn't sound like it came from a throat. It sounded like 2 wet stones being rubbed together. The car is dead," I managed to joke out. My eyes were fixed on the mirror, terrified that if I blinked, he'd be leaning over my shoulder. The man didn't move, but the car suddenly lurched forward. The engine stayed silent, the dashboard stayed dark, but we were moving. We were accelerating down the black ribbon of the highway, guided by a force I couldn't understand. The rain outside seemed to stop hitting the glass, or maybe we were moving too fast for it to land. Everything outside became a blur of black and gray. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling so hard I could barely form the words. The man slowly tilted his head. The hood of his coat slipped back just an inch. He didn't have a nose, just 2 jagged slits in a face of raw, red muscle. But he had a mouth, and he was smiling. It wasn't a human smile. His lips stretched back further than they should have, revealing gums that were black and swollen. "Home," he grated. I looked back at the road and realized we weren't on the highway anymore. We were on a narrow dirt track, overgrown with briars that clawed at the sides of the car. The trees here were different, twisted, leafless things that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The air inside the car began to smell of stagnant water and old, wet earth. "I don't live here," I sobbed, clutching the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Please, just let me out. Take the car, take everything." The figure leaned forward. I could feel the cold radiating off him, a chill that sank deep into my bones. He placed a hand on my shoulder. His fingers were freezing, and through my shirt I could feel that they weren't solid. It felt like being touched by a bag of wet slush. "We're almost there," he whispered into my ear. "The others are waiting. They've been waiting since the bridge collapsed." I remembered then. 10 years ago, a bridge on this old route had washed away during a storm. A bus had gone over the edge. No survivors. They never found all the bodies. I looked at the speedometer. It was buried at 120 miles per hour, yet there was no wind noise, no vibration, just that wet, rhythmic breathing from the seat behind me. I looked in the mirror one last time. The man was gone, but the seat was soaked through with a dark, oily sludge. I looked back at the road and my heart stopped. The dirt track ended abruptly at the edge of a jagged ravine. At the bottom, partially submerged in a black, bubbling river, sat the rusted remains of an old bus. Dozens of figures in yellow raincoats were standing around it, their eyeless faces all turned upward, watching me approach. I slammed on the brakes, but the pedal went to the floor with no resistance. The car didn't slow down. As we soared over the edge into the darkness, the last thing I heard wasn't the sound of the crash. It was a chorus of wet, clicking voices from the back seat, all whispering my name in unison. I woke up an hour ago. I'm standing on the bank of that river. I can see my car, smashed and twisted among the rocks. I can see myself, still strapped into the driver's seat, my eyes wide and vacant. I'm not cold anymore, I'm just wet. And as I look down at my hands, I see the skin turning gray and translucent. Someone is coming down the road above. I can hear the rhythmic swish thump of their wipers. I think I'll go stand in the middle of the road. I think I'll wait for them to stop. After all, it's a long walk home, and I have such a beautiful smile to share. They told me the Blackwood mine had been sealed for 60 years for a reason. They spoke of pockets of bad air and shifting rock, but in this town, stories are the only currency we have. I was young, desperate for the silver they said was left behind in the lower shafts, and arrogant enough that a sturdy rope and a brass oil lantern were all I needed to beat the dark. I didn't know that some things in the deep don't need eyes to see you. The descent was the first warning. The air changed the moment I passed the first 100 feet. It became thick, tasting of copper and old, stagnant sweat. The walls of the shaft were damp, weeping a black, oily fluid that stained my gloves. I reached the bottom of the main gallery, my lantern casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance just a second behind my own movements. The silence was so heavy it felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. I started walking toward Section 4. My boots made a rhythmic on the rusted iron tracks. After a few minutes, I stopped to check my map. One extra step. I froze. The sound had come from the darkness behind me, about 20 yards back. I swung my lantern around. The light cut through the gloom, revealing nothing but jagged rock and rotted timber supports. I waited, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Nothing, just the drip of water somewhere far off. I kept moving, faster now. I reached a narrow crawl space where the ceiling had partially collapsed. I had to get on my hands and knees, pushing my lantern ahead of me. The space was so tight I could feel the cold stone pressing against my spine. Halfway through, I heard it again. But it wasn't a footstep this time. It was a breath, a long, wet wheeze, like a man breathing through a throat full of gravel. It was coming from the crevice directly above my head. I scrambled out of the crawl space, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I scrambled into a large, vaulted chamber, an old ore pocket. I held the lantern high, and that's when I saw the piles. They weren't ore. They were bones. Thousands of them. Not just animal bones, but human rib cages, femurs, and skulls, all gnawed clean and piled neatly into mounds like some kind of sick tribute. And in the center of the room sat a man. He was sitting on a rusted ore cart, his back to me. He was hunched over, his spine protruding through his skin like a row of jagged teeth. He was naked, his flesh a sickly, translucent white, the color of a fish belly. He was holding something, a heavy iron sledgehammer, and he was methodically tapping it against the stone floor. "Hello?" I whispered, the word dying in my throat. The tapping stopped. The man didn't turn around. Instead, his neck began to extend. It stretched upward, the vertebrae popping and cracking like dry kindling until his head was nearly touching the ceiling. He slowly rotated his skull 180 degrees to look at me. He had no nose, no ears, just two huge, milky white eyes that took up half his face, and a mouth that was stitched shut with rusty wire. I didn't wait. I turned and bolted back toward the crawl space, but as I ran, the walls of the mine began to vibrate. I thought that was my heart was actually the sound of hundreds of those iron hammers hitting the walls from every direction. The mine wasn't empty. The bad air the old-timers talked about wasn't gas, it was the breath of the things that lived down here. I reached the rope at the main shaft and started climbing like a madman. My hands bled as I gripped the rough hemp. Below me, I could see the glow of my dropped lantern. In its dying light, I saw them. Dozens of those pale, long-necked things were emerging from the side tunnels. They didn't climb like humans. They skittered up the vertical walls like starving spiders, their wire-stitched mouths twitching. I reached the surface just as the sun was rising. I collapsed onto the grass, sobbing, gasping for the sweet, cold air. I looked down at my legs, expecting to see them covered in dirt. Instead, I saw a mark. Wrapped around my ankle was a handprint, burnt into my skin like a brand. It's been 3 nights since I escaped. I've moved to the city, 300 miles away from the Blackwood mine. I live on the 10th floor of a concrete apartment building, but last night I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from inside my bedroom wall. I turned off the lights and looked at the floor. In the moonlight, I saw a single, rusted iron wire lying on my rug. And then, from the darkness of the closet, I heard a sound that made my soul wither. It was the sound of a stitch popping, one by one, and then my own voice, coming from the dark, whispered, "You left your silver behind."